Okay, I have started now.
Every night and every morning, something.
Well, this room is quite empty. I guess I'll wait a couple minutes. See if anyone wants to join. It's so very empty in here. I think we should do something about this. Let's try this. Oh, that's pretty cool. So, welcome to my live reading tonight of Phantasmagoria Nova, Metafiction, Upheaval, and Apocalypse in/of Post-Millennial Cinematic Horror. Thank you very much for being here tonight. I know some of you are visiting multiple gallery spaces at the Thursday night CalArts event, so I appreciate you being here. If you have a hard time hearing me or whatever, just message me or write something in the chat window. This is my first Twitch event, so hopefully I have everything set up correctly and nothing goes too wrong. So first of all, thank you again for being here. I just wanted to read the abstract of my project, which basically is my graduate school thesis from the Aesthetics and Politics program at CalArts. So the art world is no stranger to a movement away from clear-cut community art practices, a la Friend and Enemy, to a post-millennial larval friction, hypercamouflage. This project examines the transition from community aesthetics to a tension-building model and highlights how the 21st century marks a shift in phantasmagoric horror. Pre-cinematic phantasmagoria, particularly in Victorian-era aesthetics, created optical illusions and lighting effects through the use of magic lantern projections and an exploitation of a person's environment. Phantasmagoric trickery overwhelmed, disoriented, shocked observers into catharsis. So in the scope of horror cinema, phantasmagoric deception of a spectator's senses drifted from a cathartic and anesthetizing phenomenon to a 21st century tactic that awakens and confronts us. This analysis of sensorial phantasmagoric realignment begins through the lens of Susan Buck-Morse's work on aesthetics and anesthetics, and Marina Warner's historical accounts of sacred phantasmagoria. This project, at its core, demonstrates the parallels of Dr. Nandita Biswas-Malamfi's observations regarding alternative politics and the new millennium in relation to horror cinema. So, in short, phantasmagoric horror cinematic interactions made a movement away from knowing you were being tricked within explicit boundaries of a friend-enemy dichotomy, like a magic lanternist and spectator, toward a mode of constant trickery within a ubiquitous larval state as a means to political upheaval. The project output is delivered as a zine series, which I call Phantasmagoria Nova. This project's ongoing, and it's ongoing effort, and so therefore what I submitted for my thesis and what you'll see tonight is really not the overall project. So that was the abstract, and once again, if you're just joining, if you have a hard time hearing me or anything, just message me in the chat window and hopefully I'll be able to see that. So I'm going to begin here. Hold on just 1 second. I'm gonna get a drink of water. So, Phantasmagoria Nova, horror and friction in the 21st century. This is sort of serving as an introduction for the overall project. So I was 5 years old when the box office horror movie Poltergeist hit theaters, and just a few years prior to that, the Amityville Horror made waves as the legend Curse of the Lutz family came to life on the big screen. And looking back, I certainly cannot think of a time in my life that I wasn't watching horror movies. I was quite the avid horror fan in the 10 and under demographic by the time Freddy Krueger caused a commotion in the slasher horror A Nightmare on Elm Street. So interestingly, although I think I was too young to be cognizant of the full meaning at the time, horror movies have always offered insights into the dynamic of society. Horror is the genre that is intentionally designed to, quote, scare, unsettle, and otherwise disturb its audience. This is according to Majudo and Platz. Through horror, we contemplate and process our shared fears and our collective nightmares. One paradox lies, however, in understanding Javier Aldana Reyes's affectual corporeal mode of horror rather than strict adherence to socio-political analysis. So that is, an older horror movie might speak to a prior era's woes, worries, taboos, and nightmares, but this kind of phantasmagoria still has the ability to affect us through ahistorical means. From an anecdotal perspective, as we situate ourselves in the 21st century, I see something different happening in horror cinema, and I don't think I'm alone. Some call it a move towards self-awareness, or the meta, as Aldana Reyes refers to it. Some refer to it as an explosion or rejection of the genre altogether. Amanda Beach refers to it that way. I myself argue that something has certainly occurred in horror cinema, just not sure what. So no longer are we allowed these promised boundaries of safe space within horror, within the confines of the movie theater. In fact, filmmakers leave us with this unresolved je ne sais quoi to create upheaval. I argue that this unnameable, uncomfortable jouissance is likely part of the heartbeat of this experiment and exploration I term Phantasmagoria Nova, which literally translates to New Phantasmagoria. So I decided to pursue the concept of the phantasmagoric after reading Susan Buck Morse's essay Anesthetics, Part 1 and 2. What especially interested me was how phantasmagoric horror ultimately became a public utility. Phantasmagoric magic lantern shows originated in the comfort of domestic spaces, quote, privatized fantasy worlds, but became entangled in public space. Theorist Walter Benjamin's perspective offered insight into this outward growth. People required overwhelming stimulation in public settings as a means to numb themselves or ourselves to counter the effects of modernity. So while Phantasmagoria did not always take on the task of horrifying a subject, it did take on the task of overwhelming them. The phantasmagoric phenomenon itself transforms and becomes codified within the cultural language, architecture, cinema, and the everyday. This forward momentum from private to public speaks to a radical, quote, or transgressive edge that resonates within the deterritorializing and liberating language of post-structuralism, and with the deconstructive ethos that has permeated critical writing since the turn to Derrida in the humanities. So, Dr. Aldana Reyes defines the core of affect theory here as a bridge and a reconciliation for a postmodern or paramodern, metamodern, etc. horror theory that combines and transcends phenomenology and other traditional frameworks. So with respect to my own project, the parallel I see here lies in the people's reconciliation of bourgeois private sensorial fantasies toward a deconstructed, deterritorialized public space that results in an affectual response to modernity. Perhaps on some level, my project Phantasmagoria Nova attempts to reconcile 21st century space, one in which we are all public subjects. So, what then becomes the horrifying, and by what means? So, on to the good stuff here. This is the actual reading of my project. Um, So, as kind of a context, it must be stated for clarity, however obvious, that what a viewer sees while watching a horror movie is another component of affect theory, and visual elements hold a great deal of affectual power in relation to the viewer. Aldana Reyes draws in the dynamic of potential cooperative viewership rather than a universal passive spectatorship from earlier film theory frameworks. So the visual structure of Phantasmagoria Nova, the zine, attempts to engage some of the affective visual outputs one would encounter on screen. And here we go. Thank you very much for joining. I'm sure hopefully some people will join soon. Thank you to those who have been watching so far. So we're going to put... Oh, there's this Danny from Midsummer. Oh my goodness. Hello, Danny. Why are you so sad? And here we go. We have issue 1 of Phantasmagoria Nova, titled Secrets. So on the cover here, I don't know how much I really want to get into the context of each the art object that I chose within the zine project, so I guess maybe I'll just do that here and there, but maybe not for every page. So just get here. So the history of Phantasmagoria. To approach a phantasmagoric phenomenon as simply a historic relic, a decayed and static remnant of magic lantern exhibitions from the 1800s, may be facile and dismissive. So instead, we should investigate phantasmagoric apparatus's dynamic evolution and integration into contemporary applications of interactivity, digitality, and public utility in 21st century spaces. And so this is an example of a magic lantern show. So Phantasmagoria, whether real or fantasy, disoriented a viewer and their perception. And people loved to get scared back in the day. I think we still do, in just different ways. And this is a sketch of a soldier suffering from shell shock. He has that 1,000-yard stare. So through post-World War I critiques that asserted by Walter Benjamin and Sigmund Freud, Susan Buck Morse identifies interruptions in mental function during the shift from World War I and industrial production. So that the shock of the battlefield, and that the battlefield experience of shock has become the norm in modern life. I hope I explained that correctly. Let's see, we'll just move on here. Not sure why it's going. There we go. Jumped ahead a couple. Okay, so this is page 5. Shock is becoming, or an overstimulation rather, has become normalized within everyday modernized society. So that's what these few pages are describing. And the history of Phantasmagoria continues on page 6. This scene features an excerpt from a noted magic lanternist. He's not the only one, but he is a noted magic lanternist of his time, Etienne Gaspard Robertson. And it's a very long title of the book, which I won't say because I don't speak French. But it's a very cool picture. I actually have it hanging on my wall now. So we see these darkened spaces and willing, frightened participants. And because Robertson was a known magic lanternist, this print also shows the movement of Phantasmagoria into wider public space. I'm not sure if any of my family members are watching right now, but my lovely dog Selkie is up here trying to jump up on me. It's a little distracting, so I'm sorry about that. Okay, and then page 7 keeps pausing. I'm not sure why it's pausing, but okay. Maybe Selkie just wants to be famous, so let's see if we can see Selkie in the little camera there. Okay. All right. So page 7 shows some examples of magic lantern slides, and by exploring the use of the historical use of Phantasmagoria and its shifting evolution, we can consider the future potentialities for aiding subjects within a viewing space of the phantasmagoric mechanism. Okay. And so Phantasmagoria Nova examines a more personal perspective from historian Marina Warner, and this begins on page 8. And Warner explores Phantasmagoria's ties to sacred elements, particularly the search for the elusive Catholic incorruptible body of Santa Caterina de Vigri, pictured here. What I felt was very important in this project was determining, I don't know if that's the right word, but determining the feminist voice. So for this, I decided to, for Marina Warner's segments, to handwrite them. Anything that was my own passage or my own voice, and particularly for this section, Marina Warner's passages that deal with exploration and questions concerning private to public explosion of Phantasmagoria. That, again, the text would be handwritten, and you'll see that coming up. Even though some of my written portions are under the guise as the voice from the editor, there certainly is a distinction. It's a distinction I want to make within this publication. So very few times does Jessica, the editor and creator, make an appearance in this project. Most often, however, the universal voice of the editor acts as a surrogate for my own thoughts and explorations. So let's see if it actually changes the page. There we go. So I'm not going to read these long passages, but overall, it's a very important introductory section from Marina Warner, talking about her journey to trying to find Santa Caterina in a very modern city, and she's kind of going through these mazed back alleys and such to try to find this incorruptible saint. And so I thought there were some interesting parallels in Marina Warner's journey in comparison to Phantasmagoria in the scope of Victorian era and Magic Lantern shows. And it continues. Prologue. And so, as I mentioned, my voice rarely comes through, um, but I think sometimes the choice between typing and handwriting kind of make a difference. I think particularly for more of the feminist aspect of it, having the feminist voice lost oftentimes in these historical accounts of things. So I thought it was important to have some elements of myself, maybe as the voice of an editor, but still me coming through. Hopefully I leave this on the screen for a little bit of time so you can read it. This is sort of restating what I said. There's sort of an absence of textual absence specifically of women as autonomous creators. You really have to look for anonymous, really some key markers. They're not going to specifically be evident, but they're there, but it's really difficult to find. Okay. And so by understanding the necessity that only when normal activity, the brain and the senses is at rest, can a dream occur, just as the pictures of a magic lantern can appear only after the lights of the room have been extinguished, we have a better understanding regarding how drug use ties into phantasmagoria. And so in terms of drug use specifically, there would be like rituals, almost like how you would think of maybe the Freemasons or something now. They go through these rituals to be at a space where they're convening somewhere, but I'm not saying that they do drugs or anything, but very ritualistic practice in order to watch a ghost raising show or a certain magic lantern phantasmagoria shows. So this is where the drug use comes into play here. Takes forever to change the page. Okay. And interestingly, the reason why I put a surgery theater on page 2, which would be the inner cover, is because of this element of how surgeons and scientists were having these ether frolics, which is everyone getting high on laughing gas or other kinds of drugs like that. And they realized they felt good and they felt like, yeah, they were numbed. And they decided, well, this might be a good idea to perform surgeries on our patients with ether or something like this, just to protect the surgeon's own mental state, having to see a patient writhing in pain because they're wide awake for surgery. So there's this interesting privatized to public sort of journey that Phantasmagoria makes through the use of drugs and making its way into the medical element or a medical aspect of surgery. And this is basically an example of a ghost raising salon. And so, the acolytes for this particular magic lanternist would prepare themselves by starving themselves for a day or two and then taking drugs by way of dinner or a drink. And then they would go through these mazes or whatever was set up. And then they would watch a ghost raising salon. More drug use. So Buck Morse makes this interesting observation that drug addiction giving way to other forms of shock that did not include the use of anesthetic numbing. She argues that the 19th century, by the 19th century, a narcotic was made out of reality itself, and the key word for this development is phantasmagoria. And again, this is just a reiteration of, I guess, of highlighting how phantasmagoria, drug addiction, aesthetics, anesthetics, all aid us in dealing with trauma in a way by flooding our senses to help us process our surroundings. And this is kind of close to the back cover. And because it's a zine, it needs to be, I thought it needed a little bit of levity. So to highlight some of certain aspects of the zine, I chose to reiterate them in a crossword form. Crossword form. And works cited. And then future issues on the back cover. And so when I began creating issue 2, which I'll get to here, in creating issue 2, it became clear it needed to be divided into 2 zines, or 2 sections, rather. The first addresses the movement of Phantasmagoria from private to public, which has already been addressed somewhat in issue 1. And then issue 2B, which will be read later. I think 2B actually is the one that's in the gallery below if you're looking at me from the Thursday night CalArts page. So I think there's a gallery below me that shows issue 2B. And that one kind of, I guess you could say it addresses more how Phantasmagoria behaves in the everyday, in public space specifically, and speculates how perhaps the mechanism has been weaponized in a way against us. But 2A, which I'm bringing up here. Come on. Here we go. Okay. Issue 2A, Unsettling. It's kind of disturbing, the cover. I combined 2 separate artworks. One is a sketch of a woman who smiles but stares at a viewer in a sort of uncanny valley kind of way. You don't really know what her intentions are, and I digitally layered it over a sketch onto a painted water scene. So perhaps she's floating. Perhaps the viewer is. You just don't know. And why the heck is she smiling? Like, you just really don't know. And all of this uncertainty overall is just super unsettling. Takes a moment for this to, like, respond. Okay. There we go. Okay, finally. Okay. So the beginning section of this issue addresses the flooding of the senses. So I chose photographs, drawings, etc. that complemented the text. I would hope you do that in an art project as extensive as this. Um, Phantasmagoric spirit photography was quite popular, as evidenced by this phantom girl haunting the photograph of an elderly couple. And my dog is going to make noises here behind. She's a guest speaker tonight. And moving on. And we have a woman looking into a mirror, and it's not her. So I'm not going to read every page, but yeah, you'll see that it's like you can't tell what the real and the false is, but it's still real no matter what, and that's kind of the point of Phantasmagoria, in terms of this dream organ that I'm talking about on this particular page. And this is a sketch of one of the Paris arcades, Galerie Vivien. And so we have to, before we could talk about anything else beyond issue 2A or 2B or whatever, we need to make sure that we're talking about the shift from private to public consumption of the Phantasmagoria, whatever way you're looking at it. It needs to be seen as a shift from this private sensorial space to an outward public consumption. I don't know why it takes so long to load each page. That's kind of frustrating. Okay, so again, we see Walter Benjamin's experience doing the survey of Parisian arcades and the urban landscape. So I thought that was an interesting element to add in, is the light behind the windows and just this overwhelming sensation that you would experience walking through these arcades and the shop windows. Just everything is shocking to you, and it's kind of a way to get you to buy things too. So let's see. And the next couple pages are kind of about the Hegelian dialect, if you will. So the use of phantasmagoric lights, sounds, and architecture raises a subject's own consciousness, and this journey toward acceptance occurs of reason. So it's like there's this multiple processing happening, and you come to this realization, um, uh, almost beyond words, you might say. And this is page 8. And again, thank you for joining. If you're joining late, I appreciate you just dropping by. This is my first Twitch live stream. Hopefully I've figured everything out. um, I've never used Twitch before, so this is kind of fun to be able to have these multiple visual elements on the page. It's fun. I'm sure I'll be doing something else in the future with Twitch, so this is fun. Maybe even streaming my gameplay, who knows? So I chose letters to the editor to kind of push along some sections of the zine, so it wasn't, so I could get like more text on the page without it seeming too crowded in terms of something like this, which is more of an artistic, I guess, aesthetic. That's not right, but just to kind of propel the zine along to where I wanted it to go, I'd pack in these letters to the editor to kind of speed things up a little in sections. And again, just going back here, this is another Parisian arcade, the Galerie Colbert. Different looking than the first one, but still with this idea of lights coming through the windows at a certain angle, and shop windows that are just, everything is so overwhelming. And yeah, the labor is hidden within the architecture itself. And this is sort of Mount Vesuvius. It's basically a representation of what Walter Benjamin describes as these Parisian arcades in his Phantasmagoria project. That this labor and the proletariat essentially is this, simmering beneath the slopes, and it's just an interesting kind of perspective shift to see it through a volcano instead of, I guess, a Marxist. I don't know. It's a really good visual to me. And again, this is like a literal visual, if you will, of capitalism on top, in the proletariat at the bottom. So I think this is the last page of the scene. And then we get into some crossword puzzles, I think. Oh, no, we have a couple more pages here. So I ask for future issues through these combined accounts, is it possible that we can predict the behavior of phantasmagoric experiences in 21st century spaces? I think it might be. The word search, again, is to kind of highlight some of the key terms and ideas that I discuss in the specific issue. And, okay, we're going to move on. I'm going to try to speed some of this up because I want to try to get through as many of these as I can. Okay, so I believe 2B is the one that's, yes, it is the one that is in the gallery below me if you're at the Thursday night CalArts website. But I still want to kind of look through it live here, but so this issue is at the core of present day phantasmagoria in relation to horror cinema. I think I struggled most with this issue, is I really hope to curate very specific images related to the text. Almost in the entirety of this issue is devoted to the work of scholar and theorist Nandita Biswas Malamfi, who came to CalArts a couple semesters ago for our Friday night West Hollywood Aesthetics and Politics lecture series. And her work was quite pivotal to guiding my journey in my own thesis work. So going back to the cover, so the woman on here might appear to be smiling, but perhaps she's in pain. You just really don't. It's really disturbing. It's clearly like some kind of electrical test of different muscle groups, but you can't actually tell whether she's in pain or not. And just a letter from the editor. And just on page 3, we're met with concepts that begin to tie together the past and the present. The pseudo-realities are real, but now they're weaponized to dismantle traditional forms of sovereignty. And agonism in its truest sense here means equal players on a lateral playing field. So the boxing women on page 4 know who they must fight as they see each other as equals. And so Biswas Malamfi's theories talk about this shift from traditional symmetric warfare toward an asymmetrical, it's just the opposite, asymmetrical warfare, and moving toward a hyper camouflaged situation where you can't tell who is a friend or an enemy. And that's kind of where we're at in the 21st century. And the skull here, I'd say it suggests that we can't even trust our instincts in this new reality. Just, I don't know, it's just kind of creepy. A new kind of conflict emerges on page 6, and the artwork suggests suggests that traditional lines collide and become enmeshed within each other in this new larval state. And confrontational tactics within the art world at the turn of the 21st century suggest a departure from community aesthetics. So I show Alfredo Jar's artwork called the Skogul Konstal project on pages 8 and 9, in which his art installation ends in a fiery inferno. So in this art project, he builds a structure made out of the town's main source of income, which is paper industry. So it's made out of wood and paper, and he holds art classes, and people come through and look at this art exhibit that's in there. I'm not sure everything that was shown, but at the end of the week or two, he burns the exhibit in the building to the ground, and the people are shocked into actually creating a real cultural center for their town, in which they didn't have one before. So that was kind of the point of his agonist art, if you will, was to encourage this town to actually build a creative cultural center where they could thrive. Just takes forever. And this is the building burning to the ground in front of the residence. and the act of burning it to the ground, creating this blazing inferno in front of the town. It, as I said, it highlights this agonistic modality, if you will, of his particular art practice. Um, so you're really not sure if he's coming in as a seemingly friendly entity that wants to create an art exhibit, but then it almost turns into him being this enemy to enact or try to encourage change. So a benign enemy, I'm not really sure, but some kind of agonistic force. And this artwork I chose because it reminded me of it's called Replica Obscure, but it reminded me of when you would crumple a piece of paper up and the paper could never be uncrumpled. So I mean, it's this unresolvable kind of idea that you can't go back. So there's this forward motion with 21st century phantasmagoria that I was reminded of within this particular artwork. Okay. Page 13. The background is a digital creation I call Naked Vortex of Faces. The women's faces are smiling, again like a previous issue, but there seems to be much more under the surface. And there are three key entities. If you read Nandita Biswas Malamfi's Women, I think it was the one Women Out of Time. She discusses Metis, Medea, and Mahakali. And these are three entities that I suppose you could think of them as the forces. They operate outside of this power structure, the hegemonic power structure, and so therefore are outside the force to create political upheaval rather than operating within the hegemonic structure. That's in short. I know that's really a terrible description on my part, but Nandita Biswas Malamfi's papers on this are excellent. So if you get a chance to read them, please do. And for page 17 here, I created Miss Ivana Granite. Outside the scope of this project, I made this a few years back. Um, it's a this page has a letter from the editor that addresses performance art, and although while Miss Yvonne comes from a less than serious show, which is Pee Wee Herman's Playhouse, or Pee Wee's Playhouse, um, her rage that she's experiencing during this particular scene um, is hidden constantly behind this prim and proper woman who pleases others and isn't necessarily ever allowed to show her anger. Um, and this is a particular moment where that anger comes through, and all of this is coupled with Persephone, who is trapped in Hades for eating a pomegranate. So I thought that was a nicely coupled pair. So feel free to talk to me about it later. And page 18 was the art choice in the back, if it will load, is called Patterns Godadi, and it speaks to this apparatic outside framework that Nandita Biswas Malamfi argues within the alternative politics framework. So while the quilting here might seem unstable, there are several stitching elements that are quite strong and maintain the strength or maintain the integrity of the quilt itself. Excuse me. Okay, I'm going to just step away for 1 second here. Okay. So the art choice here is a piece I call Turmeric. Um, I made it a few years ago during undergrad, and I thought it was interesting to incorporate this painting that used other, like non-traditional elements of turmeric and ash, as opposed to these traditional acrylic, etc. kind of. So turmeric and ash being like outside the hegemonic framework, if you will. So I thought that was interesting to add that in. And then this next page, while the art speaks to elements in which the people of the future speak to a time traveler in the film 12 Monkeys, the other idea behind incorporating this particular art piece is that Phantasmagoria Nova, or also known as alternative politics here, interacts with us on a cellular level, and we don't know what's inside. So it's kind of an interesting choice, I guess, to put that in. And page 21, quite literally, is a jab in the gut representation of Phantasmagoria Nova in terms of horror cinema. You're no longer leaving the theater with a sense of catharsis. You actually remember that jab in the gut rather than feel better about it. And one of my interests outside of this whole project is is seeking out and challenging hostile architecture, or violent design, as it might be called. So I immediately made the connection between Biswas Malamfi's larval tactics and the beauty of hostile architecture. So in this case, while the bench might be aesthetically pleasing to us, with all of its curlicues and iron armrests, it actually serves as an enemy to deter and punish underserved and ignored populations, namely the houseless, within public space. And on these next couple pages, shows the shifting dynamics of phantasmagoric horror into the new millennium as it relates to larval warfare. And here is Rosemary's Baby. And she's looking at the Tanis root talisman that she was given by a neighbor in the building. versus Danny in Midsommar, who overwhelms us with this larval display, if you will, of flowers. And so in Rosemary's Baby, you kind of know who's the enemy and who's your friend. And I wanted to make this jump to the 21st century where this might spoil it if you haven't seen Midsommar. So close your ears, put it on, turn the volume down. So Danny is pictured here and also on the main picture of my slideshow. The larval display is so beautiful, and how could something evil come out of that beauty? But that is actually where the enemy lies, is in this beauty. So maybe that doesn't spoil it too much. But so there's that difference between 20th century and 21st century horror. Is you end up knowing who the enemy is in a 20th century. In the 21st century, you're going, well, the enemy is this thing I really love, which is flowers and the beauty of nature. So I'm kind of uncomfortable now. What do I do? And it makes you think in a different way. So this is just an overlay of the so-called Konstal project and Danny walking during the fiery scene. If you can't tell, I do love the movie Midsommar. Watch it if you haven't seen it. Okay. So I think for this next one, for the sake of time, I'll just look at this overall picture here. So this was an element, a peripheral matter for zine 2B. So I called it micro issue 2B, and it's an 8-page microzine. And you cut down the center of the middle center frames. You cut it and then fold it together in a certain way, and it makes a little microzine. And this outlines or highlights the performance by Kubra Kademi called Armor Piece or Armor. And she basically is wearing an iron suit that accentuates certain elements of her body and walking through the streets of Kabul. Eventually she gets exiled, and I believe she's still living in Paris or France. I'm not really sure actually where she might be right now, but I think it's Paris. But after this, she was definitely exiled. And if you are interested in seeing this zine, I can certainly send it to you. I'm going to probably get them onto my website at some point, which is jessicadawn.studio. Hopefully I can do that soon. And then a newsletter, which was, I didn't want to incorporate these elements into the zines themselves because they sort of distracted from the ideas. I don't know, it's just quite wordy, so I thought maybe a newsletter would work. And it worked perfectly for this particular text, and it's just showing this movement away from community aesthetics via Grant Kester toward what Claire Bishop would look at as like an antagonistic or agonistic setting in the 21st century. So yeah, it just really worked better in this sort of newsletter setting rather than a zine itself, or a zine. And let's keep going here. So issue 3, which is what I'm showing here, it might seem like a tangent from the main themes of my overall project, um, but this issue looks specifically at the hegemonic figure that shaped and influenced media, architecture, um, and public space throughout the 20th century and into even the 21st century. Um, all elements addressed thus far in the project. So for the most part, I curated artwork that spoke directly to the hegemonic divide or the binary. That is, by observing Hefner's phantasmagoric turn, one can identify almost immediately points of exclusion and how groups of people were represented. So, and I really couldn't have done it without looking at the work of Dr. Paul B. Preciado. So, the the work itself is called, I can never say the full title. Let me just get to the works cited page here. Pornotopia, an essay on Playboy's architecture and biopolitics. I apologize, I didn't have that memorized, but that's by Paul B. Preciado. I don't know if you can see, it's about halfway down the page. So just kind of go through this. Oh, look how fast it's going now. So it's really to give us a lexicon that expands our understanding of this shift in phantasmagoria, particularly gender and sexuality from the mid-20th century until today. So I won't read this word by word, but it clearly, I'm trying to convey these ideas of the binary, gender binary, sexuality, etc., binaries, and Playboy bunnies themselves became this experiential commodity. So the Playboy empire was not selling products; they were actually selling experiences, and the Playboy bunnies were part of that experience. And again, drug use comes up, and it reinforces or reiterates gender, sexuality, sexual, gender, etc. norms within the mid-century. And Facebook, social media, etc. Combine elements of phantasmagoria, in which we're all susceptible to this illusion that conveys an aesthetic of reality, but it's actually optical effects that mask our lives within capitalist society. And Hefner's round bed, which with the touch of a button would rotate the view of the bed to a certain area in the room. So one part of the room would be watching a television in like a den area. If you changed the position of it again, it would be more of an eating nook or something. So there were different areas of the room, and you didn't even have to leave the bed. And that harkens parallel to the birth control pack. Whoops, let me go back. So the round shape of the bed and its rotation also symbolize the birth control pill, that is a sexually liberated woman, meant more sexual opportunities for the urban playboy. Sorry, we're doing a like plug-in time here. Okay. We good? Okay.
Sorry.
And the male gaze, this page obviously is just an ad from Playboy magazine. And what does it mean, or what kind of man reads Playboy? And it just reiterating what kind of man you should be, and you should be reading Playboy, etc. And Atomic Energy was branded through the woman's sexuality to become more accepted. So again, these are all like peripheral ideas to the magic lanternist of the Victorian era and horror cinema, but they do have meaning in terms of describing these binaries within gender and sexuality. Little Foucault there. And speaking of Foucault, the way bodies navigated living spaces, you could see that in this architectural Playboy penthouse design. So women basically were allowed in certain areas of this penthouse, and the men navigated other additional spaces that the women were really not welcome in. And so, yeah, the Playboy man relies on this exclusion through binaries, and the lone hero men of both past and present have been taught to value power, autonomy, and the freedom as things that are owed to them, and to dominate everything else that they see as lesser. So we have some letters to the editor and crossword. Okay. And someone says they loved the larval horror. Thank you very much. I'm glad you saw that. Okay. So I was quite excited to begin this issue. Now that the previous issues of Phantasmagoria Nova addressed the early frameworks of Phantasmagoria, visual culture, rituals, attitudes, alternative politics, agonism, etc., I could really begin to move the work toward a more contemporary, even digital aesthetic, and explore why 21st century horror cinema is now the site of unresolve. So this cover photo brings back this disturbing, unknowable smile of the woman in Sweet Dreams. I believe that was on issue 2B. Actually 2A, I think. Getting these mixed up. And I layered it within a lucid dream painting I called Balloons on the Shore. Traditionally, one would feel happiness, or should feel happiness, during an outing to a beach boardwalk. But instead, the combination of these two scenes together feels more nightmarish than pleasant. That's just how I see it. Excuse me. The artwork on page 3, if it will actually move. I wonder if there's a drinking game now for every time I complain about how slow this moves. Navigating left and right here. So page 3 draws back to Nandita Biswas Malamfi's theories on enmeshed frameworks. So a single point within the electrifying structure would almost appear as nothing, but together actually creates a network and becomes invisible through the everyday. And early on in my research, I was interested in Gernot Reither's art exhibitions and his designs. So his writing and art projects were especially keen on manipulating space, and I believe potentially proving that Walter Benjamin's inquiries concerning heightened interaction in public space had finally arrived. And we'll get to that in a second here. Just kind of flip through some of these pages. And this point of heightened interaction in public space can also be seen in phantasmagoric exhibits such as the Meow Wolf Museum in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Amongst the brightly lit, disorienting, and almost futuristic looking spaces, guests of the museum are encouraged to interact with the artworks rather than just be passive spectators. And this is one of Reither's architectural artworks, which was used as a backdrop for a fashion show. This page, I quite literally note that Reither's exhibitions of light, sound, and the disorientation of the senses offer us examples of Phantasmagoria nova. So Reither's weird art installations are actually examples of Biswas Malamphy's asymmetrical confrontations within public space. His artwork, such as Urban Blanket, which is shown here, requires a response from viewers, and they form new understandings of their own subjectivities and their surroundings. The flooding sensation can no longer numb a participant's senses, but instead creates a challenge. And let me just jump through here. Drinking game. This is loading again. It's really slow. Okay, here we go. This is another one of his artworks. And page 16 and 17 speak to me personally. I'll never forget the dread I felt as I took on the perspective of young Cole in The Sixth Sense, blurring this line between observer Cole and me in the theater. The wide angle simulates my own human vision as opposed to my lizard vision, I guess. I don't know. And my eyes make my way to the right-hand side of the screen where an unknown terror stands. And this is from Gretel and Hansel. And I thought it was really interesting to see these. These are supposed to be side by side in the zine. So really long shots with a woman on the right. And I don't know if there's a significance in that, but I just love the setup of both of these shots. You're like forced to explore the space in a different way. Okay. And I just we have this last one here. Hooray! Not going over it by too much. And this issue, issue 5, introduces and prepares readers like you, maybe, um, uh, prepares us all for future issues that aren't included in this thesis project I submitted. So my research culminates right now into Apocalypse as a key moment in the emergence of Phantasmagoria Nova. What we once knew no longer exists, nor can exist. Issue 4 begins to highlight these key elements from my summer curatorial residency at Hauser and Wirth, Los Angeles. And while horror has been a subversive mode for those outside hegemonic power, this type of it's always been a way to speak for voices ignored in popular cinema, I guess. This type of cinema has found a reawakening in the 21st century and provides extra power to counter hegemonic voices. So I'll just kind of scroll through some of these. This cover page was from an alcohol ink tile work that I made. And then I just mirror image so it looks like the actual sun. That was what I was hoping for when I made it. And it looks like the kernels of the sun's surface and everything. So it's an apocalypse. And this was my curatorial residency, which really helped me to explore elements of my thesis project, helped me to throw elements out that really weren't working. So yeah, let me kind of take a risk, and was definitely a really fun summer. And I got to meet a lot of really talented artists and brilliant minds. And so the first module was looking at the genealogy and backdrop of pre-cinematic horror, which would be Magic Lantern, Phantasmagoria. And the second module explored this threshold of horror cinema, and transitioned the overall exhibit to the crux of my thesis, which would be that post-millennial horror cinema confronts us through a jab in the gut rather than giving us this catharsis. And the final module, which I haven't quite had a chance to address in the project, that's coming up in another issue, would be a different element of apocalypse, looking at normativity and disability representation that are born out of Western capitalist patriarchy, for example. So those are in upcoming issues. And this is the library of the exhibit. These are all books I curated that sort of have defined my project or define horror in the Victorian era to now, from different perspectives. Anything in particular there? Lots of zombie books, I realize. So the exhibit overall left me still trying to figure out, like, what was the mechanism behind this lack of catharsis. So this is kind of an ongoing project, as I've mentioned, and discovering what the mechanism is still hasn't really been fully defined. And I know I'm part of the conversation. I'm not the only one talking about this. So definitely looking at theorists like Nandita Biswas Bilamfi, or Javier Aldana Reyes, who talks about corporeal affect in horror. So he's bridging this gap between Masumi's affect theory and horror cinema. So that's real. It's really been enlightening, illuminating, if you will. And I think that's about it. I have one more page on here. One more, I think. A couple more. Sorry. Another element of the apocalypse was looking at Joanna Zielinska's online digital or online book, which I think has actually been finally published in paper form, called End of Man. I think that's the actual title. And in it, talking about these masculinist Anthropocene fantasies where um, uh, man is done with the land and he leaves it and goes off to explore and create create his fantasies elsewhere. Um, so that really reminded me of Elon Musk, for example. um, Very privileged perspective, and someone named Young Jin Lee, who's a playwright, um, defines this moment that we're in as this, or excuse me, defines this examination as default humans. So Elon Musk is a default human, and Joanna Zelenska's bringing it to the surface, saying that it's an end of the default human, and that's kind of where we're at right now. It's in its death throes, if you will. So um, I don't know what else to say about this section. I kind of stumble if I'm not too close to a script. But yeah, it's the death throes of masculinity and hegemony right now. So it's putting up a good fight, that's for sure. And that is it. So in the future, I plan to have more on apocalypse and post-millennial horror for sure. That's the main theme. Looking at the found footage specifically and that evolution and the perspectives of like a movie like Blair Witch versus a newer one, which would be one I just watched, Hell House LLC. Kind of what shifts have happened between these last 20 years or so. Looking at race and ethnicity in the Anthropocene through Mike Hoolboom's Lacan Palestine experimental documentary, and why that's so important to see that documentary as being on the threshold of uh, real and fiction. So I look forward to getting that one out soon. It's almost done. Um, Looking at horror noir in more detail as through the lens of Dr. Robin R. Means Coleman, who has informed horror filmmakers such as Britt Banks, who spoke at my exhibit this summer. Um, I'm thinking about calling that one Enter Precarity, but I'm not quite sure on the title of that. And then overall, looking at this horrific upheaval of by way of fantasy and exploiting the cult. So looking at in more detail, Midsummer. Sorry about my dog. Looking at Midsummer versus Rosemary's Baby, or other cult movies, and how the cult is informing us and informing our subjectivities, or uh, targeting our subjectivities over the last 100 years or whatever. So I think that's it. I want to leave this open for Q&A if anyone's still watching. I'm hoping to get these onto my website, jessicadawn.studio. I think you can see it there on the screen. So I don't see anyone in the chat, in either chat window. But feel free to contact me afterwards. You can, I think you should be able to reach me through Twitch or at on Instagram. It's at howdy_selkie, HOWDY_Selkie, SELKIE. So I'm just gonna say hello. But again, I'll just kind of stick around for a couple minutes if anyone wants to ask anything via chat through the Thursday night website or the Twitch website, whichever one you prefer. I have them both up right now, so hopefully I'm using this right and I can see everything that people are planning to write. Okay. I also want to thank CalArts for hosting this. Being an art school, and it's just really, really difficult to comprehend how you could have an art school um, be virtual. And so they're really trying hard with this virtual gallery format, and it is really awesome. So I'm definitely going to be visiting next Thursday and perusing all the spaces. And thank you to Madeline Falcone, who was the curator. I'm not sure for all of the spaces, I would guess, but thank you very much, Madeline, for all of your hard work. So I'm going to leave it there. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. It's been really interesting for a first time Twitch stream. Just to see all of the layers I can put on my screen, and kind of looks like 1980s fonts, but you know, it works. So thank you again for tuning in, and feel free to reach out to me by my website or through the Instagram. And I see my sister saying hello. Hello, sister. um, and I hope you all have a good evening and you stay safe and stay healthy, and hopefully you all have a dog or a cat or some other friend to hug tonight, and I'll see you all later. Thank you.